Welcome to Green Roof Talk. I'm Brad Garner. I'm joined today by Dr. Whitney Griffin and Michael Furbish, and we're going to talk about stewardship of rooftop ecology. Whitney and Michael, what is stewardship?
Well, I think stewardship is the care of a resource, and in the case of a green roof, it's a trained, knowledgeable steward going out who understands roof ecology, who can guide that ecology into some end goal in mind, some desirable outcome. Regardless of the parameters that are going to affect that green roof over time, we can strive to reach some desired outcome.
I think that's a good description. We've adopted the term stewardship as opposed to the industry standard of maintenance, only because in our mind, the notion of maintenance is trying to hold on to a static condition. And more often than not, people would think about holding on to the static condition of plans and specs, what was installed. We view the green roof as a living machine. It's an evolving ecology. And our job is to be responsible managers of that, to be stewards of what is naturally occurring on the roof over time.
I've seen some green roofs where shortly after it's planted, what's naturally occurring is that the plants actually don't live, and then you see brown media or the roof gets overcome with weeds. Is that kind of along the lines of what you're talking about?
Well, certainly that is an illustration of an evolving ecology, but we would consider that to be evolving the wrong direction. If we're performing a good job as stewards, we would think that the evolution will be going toward greater diversity, greater plant coverage, and a more diverse ecology.
Okay. Well, let's look at some examples. For this project, which is Fallsway Housing in Baltimore, I know that on that project it was originally planted with sedum plugs, with about a dozen different types of sedums that you can see they're really small when they were first planted, but then after about a year and then 2 years, this roof is really full and becoming really lush with a wide variety of those sedums that are planted, both the narrow leaves and the broadleafs. The broadleafs are a little bit taller, so they're probably more visually prominent, but I think that this is a really even mix and even distribution of those species. And you can see it after about year 4 and 5, and then here we are about 7 or 8 years down the road, and it looks pretty much like the same type of sedums that were originally planted. They're just fuller and more mature, and there hasn't been a whole lot of change in that from the original design. And I think most of the time that is what designers and specifiers and building owners are expecting to see from their green roofs.
Capital One is in Tysons Corner, Virginia. It is a very unique system. It was super ultra thin, 2 inches of media. There was irrigation that was intended. It was installed permanently with the system, and it was planted with pre-grown sedum mats. Now, those pre-vegetated mats were nearly all narrow leaf, very heavy on sedum sexangulaire and sedum acre when they were first installed. After a couple of years, the palette began to change. The Camp Shaticum really began to take off. We started seeing some clovers coming in, and then the narrow leaves started to secede. And we understand that narrow leaves, especially albums, sexangulaires, acres, they can really start to recede back in times of drought, which is interesting since the sedum was irrigated, the system was, but we really still saw this shift in the ecology. By years 6 through 8, we actually saw grasses and native wildflowers coming in. We still had primarily broadleaf sedums with just a few narrow leaves interspersed. But the ecology is stable, it's healthy, it's green. We've had the irrigation turned off for the last 4 years. We haven't had any issues. It's a very successful, stable system, even though the original intended plant palette is not what we have today. Those pre-grown sedum mats changed from the time that they were installed, but the system is healthy and happy and great.
So here's another example that's similar to Cap 1, but with some pretty dramatic differences. This is the Pico roof in downtown Philadelphia. It's a little bit more than an acre. Most of the roof is an extensive green roof established with pre-grown sedum mat. But there's also a landscaping feature that welcomes people to come out. There's a little bit of placemaking going on here that involves having perennial beds adjacent to the extensive green roof. So how do we define success when we look at two different conditions going on in the same roof? For the extensive green roof area, success is really going to be viable ground cover. What we've seen over time is that if we plant 7, 8, 10 different sedum, 4 or 5 years down the road, we're going to have a much higher concentration of a few of those, like the broader leaves, like Kamchaticum. We find that to be pretty typical. We also view it as highly successful because the stronger plant is viable and it's taking over. We might also see that there will be the broad variety of originally planted sedums is sort of existing, commingled together, and that would be normal as well. Either of those, as long as there's full coverage and viable plant health, we would view that as a successful extensive green roof. On the perennial beds, how would we define success? It would be similar. It's that the design intent is becoming viable and robust. It typically takes a little bit longer in the perennial beds, but here we have ornamental grasses, echinacea, caryopsis, asters. We're looking for all of those to become viable, and this is an irrigated situation that usually takes a little bit more input to get established. So what happens over time when we see these two conditions commingled? At Pico, what we saw is the ornamental grasses, which were prolific self-seeders, have wandered into the extensive area. And we see that all throughout the roof. We see basically a sedum meadow now being infiltrated with ornamental grasses. And so how do we think about the success of that roof? If our objective is to welcome diversity and evolving ecology, and we see those grasses wanting to wander around the roof and they're perfectly viable, from a plant health perspective and coverage of the roof and the performance of stormwater management, that would be in many ways deemed a successful roof. If, however, the client wants to maintain exactly plans and specs in terms of which plants are staying in which areas, in order to achieve success there, we would need a much more rigorous maintenance program to prune out the ornamental grasses that are wandering around the roof in the extensive areas and try to maintain the original design intent for the perennial garden separate from the extensive garden.
So both of those prior examples are somewhat common outcomes, but sometimes the roof undergoes a few more subtle changes. This is Park Place. It was in Annapolis, Maryland, and it was planted with our typical mix of sedum plants. We planted it from plugs, pretty good mix of narrowleaf and broadleaves with a few allium accents. The roof grew and it filled in. It was a very nice mix, but soon the Kamchaticum started to really become dominant. And then shortly thereafter, we saw the alliums really start coming in more heavily. Now for Cap 1, we saw that it was right next to a construction zone, so there were wildflower and grass seeds. It's not that far off the ground, so that's a determining factor. For Park Place, it sits right on the edge of the forest, so you would assume that you would see other species coming in, things that weren't originally in the planting plan, but we haven't seen that. So this change is a little bit more subtle. We're seeing a change in the ratio of species that started out on the roof, but we are still seeing those same species. So this is another example of an evolving ecology. It's just a little bit more subtle.
This project is Regency Housing in DC, and this roof has several different roof elevations that the green roof was basically placed such that the surface is mostly level and the deeper areas of the roof are used to create deeper areas of soil, which allowed for planting of some taller native perennials, several grasses, and there's yarrow and echinacea and other plants like that. And this project was not irrigated at all, and we can see that as the roof starts to grow, that the taller native perennial areas are growing like we would expect that they would, where the grasses are getting really tall and there are several flowering perennials that are around them, and the thinner 4-inch deep extensive areas, they're mostly becoming covered with a mix of narrowleaf and broadleaf sedums. But then over time we can see that there is a little bit more mixing of these plants, where some of the native perennials escape, as it were, into these thin profile unirrigated areas, and then several of the sedums are getting in, around, and kind of under some of the grasses and such. After about 8 years, this is a really stable, beautiful, and healthy green roof, and I can see how it has taken the hand of a trained steward to guide it toward that really healthy, stable place.
Brad, I think you've got it. The design intent is really just a starting point for the rooftop ecology. What we're going to end up with on the roof 3, 5, 7 years later may not look anything like it started out just after installation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the ecology could change and it could be very diverse. And a good steward of that is really going to be able to drive towards a desired outcome no matter what it looks like.
Yeah, I think we see this all the time where volunteers are coming into the green roof environment, and that should not be deemed as a negative. It should, from our viewpoint, it's a positive as long as those plants are constructive to the ecology. And if those are natives, all the better. And we're seeing more and more that architects and specifiers would like the original planting plan to be natives.
Right.
We try to manage expectations when we see that, because as much as we would like to see those natives, the condition on the roof by design is not typically the native condition in our area. So sometimes the best way to end up with diverse natives as a predominant part of the green roof is not at all to start with the natives. It's to start with another plant palette that will serve as, in essence, the nursery crop to create the condition where the natives will come in. So let's take a look at Sidwell Friends School in the DC area. We got called into this project a couple of years after it was installed, and they were having problems with plant establishment there. This was a roof that was designed, for the most part, in all natives, and they were not having success with getting those established. Now, we could attribute that lack of success to a number of different factors, one of which is the condition on the roof is not really mimicking the conditions in nature where these plants were growing. But we also had a challenged growth media. And I think we probably, when I say we, I think the school probably also had a maintenance protocol that was not really up to the task of what they were trying to grow. So then the plant palette on that roof essentially failed, and then it sat for a couple of years. So we had all sorts of things in the growth media, and it was decided that the best solution was just to take all the growth media off the roof and start over again. By that time, the school was really interested in how do we get successful coverage on the roof. Yes, they wanted diversity, and they wanted to see natives, but they didn't want to try to force that to happen if it wasn't the right way to go. So when we reestablished the roof, the predominant plant palette was our typical extensive green roof sedum cover with accent plants that were natives. And over time, what we have seen is we've gotten good coverage on the roof, and as As the sedums established more quickly over time, the natives have somewhat joined in the plant coverage of that roof. And we welcome over time seeing the natives continue. And part of our maintenance protocol is not to try to hold fast to a sedum cover and simply allow nature to evolve.
Here's a cool project that also had a rocky start. This is a private residence out in Virginia. We planted it, installed it to spec, and it failed to thrive. Heuchera grew, but it was pretty vulnerable given the limited soil ecology around it, so it never really took off. We started looking around, we saw that this was mostly shaded, and we decided to introduce a non-traditional plant, Sedum sarmentosum. Now, if you do some light Googling on Sedum sarmentosum, you'll see that some people like to classify that as a weed. It grows in the most unconventional places, and it will really handle a lot of high stress, but it's generally well behaved as far as we're concerned. So we planted this as a nurse crop on the roof, and it took hold. The soil moisture levels started to really calm down and stabilize, and as soon as we got soil moisture figured out, everything else was able to fill in as expected. The heuchera expanded and began to colonize some of the areas. We had native strawberries come in, Virginia creeper has done very well, raspberries, echinacea, and now we have a healthy, stable woodland ecology. It resembles a beautiful clearing in the forest floor, a little find in the woods, and this is one of our favorite projects. It's very unique.
That was a beautiful green roof, and so different from most of the other ones that I've seen. I think we've got time for one more. Is there any other interesting plant palette that you guys are working with right now?
I think we ought to take a look at the Fort Reno project. This is a noteworthy project because it's the poster child for DC Water's commitment to green infrastructure. Right now, DC Water's in the midst of a huge, what they call gray infrastructure project, essentially rebuilding infrastructure under the streets to address their combined sewer overflow problem. They've made a commitment to also implementing green infrastructure, and this project at the Fort Reno Reservoir is probably the most significant. It's a little bit more than an acre, and it's easily accessible by the public, and they want to take people up and show it. And as a result, they've got a very diverse plant palette, which we think is very exciting. The entire system is a 4-inch profile. That 4-inch climbs up over small mounds that were created with polystyrene spacers, but essentially it's a 4-inch green roof profile with drip irrigation integrated, because we know with this diverse plant palette there are going to be some plants that need some irrigation to get established and perhaps bridge through drought conditions. And we planted this roof last year right as we were approaching the winter. We're going to see, as we get into the first couple of growing seasons, some species grow faster than others. But over time, this should be a really exciting roof.
Now, this is not your typical extensive sedum green roof mix. In addition to the sedums, we had Delosperma, we had creeping thyme, we had sempervivums, we had Coreopsis, Rudbeckia or black-eyed Susan, several different species of Achillea or yarrow, and we even had the local native Tradescantia.
That is a really diverse plant list. I can't wait to see how it evolves and matures over time. And I would suspect, given the diversity of species that you have there and the different conditions on the rooftop, that you're going to have to make some pretty interesting and careful decisions about the best way to act as a steward of that ecosystem.
Absolutely, Brad. So over time, a roof is going to change at the microbial level, at the chemical level, and at the physical level. Some of those changes can be, as the roof grows, that biomass is going to start degrading. We will remove some of it, but some of it does go back into the soil. increases the organic matter. Sometimes that increase in organic matter can actually lead to an increase in, or excuse me, a decrease in the soil pH. That can change the conditions for plants. We can also see an increase in the plant cover over the top of the surface of the substrate. That can lead to more stable moisture contents across the roof. That can increase the competitiveness for other volunteer species. We can also see a decrease in particle size. We know that substrate particles can break down from physical weathering, from freeze-thaw cycles. We know that the Fort Reno project is very pedestrian accessible, so as people walk around, we could have some degrading. As those particles decrease in size, we're going to have a decrease in the pore space, and that can actually increase water holding capacity. So as the roof system over time can hold more water, we'll see a completely different plant palette that's able to be supported. Sometimes will lead to more competitive species, things that weren't the pioneers that we started out with, that are able to be supported on that roof.
And as we see that ecology evolve, we're typically going to see more urban habitat created. And as stewards, we'd like to be observant of what that habitat is and report on that as well. We're finding examples all the time of habitat creation. We're seeing bees and other beneficial pollinators, birds such as killdeer, butterflies, moths, grasshoppers, mantises, many species that we're finding to be common on green roofs. They're often feeding on smaller creatures, and we believe this is just indication of a healthier ecology, including healthy soil ecology. The role of the steward is guiding the roof to a healthy state that can support a stable rooftop ecology.
I think that is really fascinating. I hope we all learned a lot about rooftop ecology today. I certainly learned a lot about thinking as a steward of rooftop ecology, and I hope that everybody enjoyed the presentation and that you'll join us for the next episode.
Thank you, Brad.